All right, great. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for joining. This is really exciting. I am really excited to have you all here. We're going to start off with a few announcements, then we're going to go have tonight's talk, and then we're going to wrap it up. So let's get started, shall we? So I just want to point out that UX Research and Strategy is on several social media channels. So if you feel so inclined, we have a lot of great content on our YouTube channel. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go along. Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So I'd love to have you join us on those avenues. Also, I love video. So if you want to be on video, I like to see happy smiling faces or even unhappy smiling faces. So please turn your video on. So I make sure that, there's a few of you not fallen asleep yet. Yes, video, love it. Yes, let me see these faces. Yes, okay, great. Keep them coming. If you don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine too. I respect that, but I do like to see smiling faces. So please feel free to turn it on. Okay. First, let's talk about some upcoming events. We have another event, June 23rd. What day of the week is that? Is that Wednesday? Is that Tuesday? I can't remember. June 23rd, same bat time, same bat channel. A little bit, no, 5:30, a little bit later, Central Daylight Time. We have Michaela Mora. She's actually on the call today. So say hi to Michaela. She's going to be talking about how to leverage UX and market research. There's been some confusion between these two. What are they? What's the differences or not? So she's going to demystify all the differences. And tickets are available on our Eventbrite. That's a free event. So feel free to check that out. I believe we're going to, we have the link in the chat as well. So feel free to get a ticket to that. Also, we just released tickets to this like yesterday. This is going to be a very cool event. We have 3 powerhouse hiring managers that are going to tell us how to get that next UX job. So we have people from different companies, big companies that you probably are familiar with. And we're going to have a hiring panel, just going to shoot them some questions and have them help us understand what are they looking for when it comes to UX researchers and strategists. Probably a little bit of design too. So, whatever your discipline is, this is July 13th at 5 p.m. Tickets are also available on Eventbrite. They're open now. So when you go over to get a ticket to Michaela's event, grab a ticket to this too. And we have not quite released this yet because this is going to be available first to our Slack community. So we have the one and only Adam Polanski, who is amazing, and he's going to give 2 workshops. He's going to give one in the morning for the US and one in the evening for international time zones, which we're really excited about to be able to reach our international community. So if you want first dibs at these very small workshops, we're only going to have 25 people per workshop. And this is an amazing workshop. He's given this a few times at major conferences around the world. If you want first dibs to Adam's workshop, join our Slack channel. And so Mallory's put the link to Slack in the chat. And that is the way to get your first dibs on the tickets. We're going to release them there to our Slack community first, and then we're going to release them to the general public if there's any available. 50 tickets total. That's not a lot. So just pointing this out, join the Slack channel first and get first dibs to Adam's workshop. Also, we have a new form. We had a Google form before and it got crowded with lots of people and everybody wanted to share their LinkedIn, and Google had some technical constraints that it would only allow so many people. So we're trying a new process where we're going to have you fill in a form to submit your contact information, your LinkedIn profile, and then we'll make that data available to everybody. This is completely optional, opt-in. You don't have to do this, but you can if you'd like to meet other people from this UX community and share your information, optionally, of course, with others. Fill out this form. Mallory has thrown that in the chat. So if you put that information, your contact information in there, and hopefully make some strong connections, then we're going to share out the results of the form so that you can see that too. So just want to point that out. We're trying this new process. If it's funky or weird, let us know. And how you're going to let us know? Because you're going to fill out this follow-up survey from tonight's event. And we also are throwing that in the chat. Your feedback feeds our programs, it feeds our format, it feeds what we do. We do things based on what you want us to do. So your voice matters. We want to hear it. So please fill out the follow-up survey. It'll also come in your email later. Just let us know what you think, how we can improve, how we can make things better. So let me introduce tonight's speaker. You may have seen her before. It's the same person that's here right now. So I'm going to switch a little bit and get started on the art of UX interviews. As soon as I open the right tab. Half the battle, technology, you know how I am. All right, great. Thank you. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am really excited to give this webinar. This was something that we've heard a lot about in our community. We sent out, what do you want to hear? And this was like voted #1 many months in a row. So I am really excited to be giving this. Now, I want to share a few reminders before I begin. This session is going to be recorded, but it's not going to be available on our YouTube channel. It's going to be available on our Vimeo channel. You got a ticket to tonight's event. You have a ticket to, you have lifetime viewing access to this video on Vimeo. So one thing I want you to be aware of, the email that you use to register for this event on Eventbrite is the email we will send the Vimeo link to you. So many of us have multiple emails. Just be mindful that that's the email that it's going to be sent to, is the one you registered with Eventbrite. Please, please, please stay on mute and put your questions in the chat. We have a few people here that might answer them in advance, and some we're going to probably hold them to the end. Chances are pretty good I might address your question along the way, so that's why I like to take them at the end. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them either along the way or toward the end. And we really value respect in this community, so we ask you to do the same. We've had a little bit of challenges with Zoom bombers and things like that. Thank you for those who kind of grin and bear those circumstances, but we still expect a community of respect here. So make sure that you're not passing any microaggressions or anything inappropriate to anybody here also on the call. So just be nice, be loving and be nice. Okay, so we have a ton to cover, and I mean, buckle up. Let's go. We're ready to go. All right. So let me walk through a scenario. You've been told that you need to find out about your customers. Your company's going to release a new product, and they want to know, will customers use it? Okay, so a slight panic sets in, and you're not 100% sure how you're going to find this out. What research method should you use? What questions should you ask? How do you set yourself up for success? Well, don't worry. This talk is going to do just that. It's going to set you up for success for your next UX interview. So I want to take a second to define art. The Oxford Dictionary defines art as the expression or application of human skill and imagination. Okay, so how does that relate to UX interviews? Well, sometimes you have to use your imagination and be a little bit creative. You have to come up with a good research plan of attack, but you need to adjust the interview on the fly. You need to come up with great follow-up questions so that you can pull the data and the insights out of your participant. And sometimes you have to be a little bit of an artiste to get this job done. So let's go through what we're going to talk about today. First, just to be clear, this talk is about how to conduct user interviews for UX research. It's not about how to prepare for a job UX interview. We already have a video on that, and that's on Vimeo, and we're going to throw the link into the chat. If you want to know how to prepare for your next UX job interview, we got you covered there. So feel free to check that out. But let's talk about what we are going to cover today. We're going to talk about how to get ready for the interview, how to prepare your research plan and your discussion guide, and some of the logistics around getting ready. We're going to talk about your role, how to conduct yourself and build rapport with your participant. We're going to talk about how to write great questions and how to avoid flawed and biased questions. And despite what we might want, not everything's going to go to plan. So I'm going to talk about a couple ways when things go awry, how to overcome those challenges. And I'm going to sprinkle in a few pro tips and tricks along the way. So I want you to be prepared to make yourself a UX interviewer master artiste. So let's go through what we're going to talk about. What I'm hoping you'll take away from this talk today. I want you to have a high level understanding of how to prepare for success. I want to give you some key phrases to include in your questions. I'm going to tell you how to structure good questions to avoid bias, leading, and priming the participant. I'm going to show you some examples of some bad questions and how to improve them. But I'm going to talk about what we're not going to cover today. Let's level set a little bit. I'm not going to tell you exactly what you should include in your discussion guide, nor am I going to tell you the specific questions that you need to ask. I'm not going to go into how to recruit participants. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into analysis. And the reason why is because we also already have a video for that. That's on our YouTube channel. Adrian did a great video on how it's in the details, the magic of analyzing user research. So we're going to throw that link in the chat. You can check that out later on how to analyze research data from qualitative interviews. And I'm also not going to really talk about the technologies that you would use of in-person versus remote or some of the things around that. And the reason I'm not going to cover a lot of these is because they could probably be their own talk. And I don't want to keep you here for 6 hours. So we had to limit the scope a little bit. So maybe some of you have seen this chart. Anybody seen this chart? Does this look familiar to some people? Yeah, for sure. So this classic chart is from Christian Royer. And actually, a few of us here on the call have worked with Christian when we were working together. And this chart shows several UX research methods and when to use them. So the pink reddish squares on this chart represent when you would potentially approach an interview. So as you can see here, you conduct user interviews more so when you want to learn about behavioral aspects from your users. It's a qualitative method, and it's usually conducted with one participant to get a deep understanding. So when might we specifically actually do a user interview? Well, you can do user interviews before or after other research methods for going into a deeper understanding of the why. So for example, let's say you've sent out a survey and you found out the what, but now you want to understand the why. Or after looking at some analytics, you see that people are falling out of your conversion funnel and you want to find out why that's happening. Well, you can use some one-on-one interviews to find out why they are abandoning your shopping cart. And basically, this is a method to get that context and understanding as to why something is or is not happening. And it may seem obvious, but in order to conduct interviews, you actually need to have access to users. If you don't, let's say because executives won't let you or the sales department won't tell you who they are, then it's going to be pretty difficult to conduct interviews. And like I said before, you can rely on interviews after other sources, like maybe you did an intercept survey and it didn't provide all the information you were looking for. Interviews are a great way to understand a bit more. And I think it's really important to mention that interviews are a good research method when you actually have the time to conduct interviews. This is not always the case. One-on-one interviews are time-consuming, not just to conduct them, but to analyze them. So make sure you have the time to do so. And finally, interviews are a great way to understand a person's process. You talk to them, see how they do things, and in doing so, you learn about the steps they take to get things done and the why. So that being said, there are times when interviews may not be the most appropriate research method. Maybe you only need to understand the what. You don't always need to do a deep dive into things. So in that case, it's okay to stay in the shallow end of the kiddie pool. Maybe you don't know what you want to learn. And this is kind of a big one. And this is why I'm going to talk about having goals and objectives for your interview. Don't waste your participants' time and your team's time by not having some goal going into the interview. Again, if you don't have access to users, it's going to be really difficult to conduct interviews. And if you can answer your questions through other means, maybe analytics or a survey or existing research or secondary research, don't need to do an interview. And like I said before, conducting interviews and analyzing data takes time. So if you don't have the time and resources to do it, it might not be the method for you. And finally, if you already have a clear understanding of someone's process, interviewing them just may not be necessary. So let's talk about the pros and cons of conducting interviews. First, what are the benefits of interviews? Well, again, this method is great for a deep understanding from your users. And unlike focus groups, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, you get that individual perspective. And finally, in-depth interviews will give you way more information than a survey ever will likely reveal. People don't take the time to write out feedback in a survey as much as you'd like to think they would. So it's easier to get that information from them when they speak out loud. But there are some downsides to conducting interviews, so let's talk about those. Interviews are usually people telling you about their experience and not always showing you. So there can be a difference between what they tell you versus what they actually do. And honestly, sometimes people you interview might be an outlier. Not every person you talk to is representative of a majority of your users. And as I mentioned before, conducting interviews is time and resource consuming, so make sure you have the resources to do them. And along that same lines, analysis too. Resources, gotta have them. So let's switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about focus groups, because I'm sure many of you here are familiar with focus groups. So what that is it's a form of interviews, but instead of one-on-one, which is what I'm going to focus on tonight, it's usually with a small group of people, say like 3 to 6 participants, not a fixed number, generalization there. And they're all answering the questions together. And maybe you've heard this rationale from an executive before about focus groups. They say you could get 4 times the data if you have 4 people talking in a session rather than 1. Or you might hear people spark ideas off each other and facilitate more conversation because they're contributing to what others say. So, okay, that's good to know. There are some benefits to conducting interviews in a small group. It's still face-to-face, even if you're over video. So you're getting that face time and that human connection that a survey won't ever give you. And yeah, you might get some more bang for your buck. The idea is you get 4 times the data if you're talking to 4 different people instead of just 1. And a focus group is often easier to sell to executives. They're very much familiar with this method and they love them. And sometimes, yes, people build ideas off each other and spur additional thoughts. And obviously, a lot of times, focus groups will allow you to take a deeper dive than surveys will. But on the flip side, there are some less than perfect aspects of a focus group. You have this idea of groupthink. And what that is once an opinion is rolled out by the group, people tend to latch on to that. And that is what groupthink is. And what happens is, like, a lot of times dominant voices are often the ones heard and other people don't speak. The extroverts take over and the introverts kind of sit back. And this too can affect the group dynamics. And it's not individual. This can lead to that groupthink idea. And you often don't even hear from everybody. So I know what you might be thinking. Well, you can call on everyone individually and get their answers. Well, that takes up a lot of time. And if you're going to do that, you might as well do a one-on-one interview anyways. And it's also not natural in some ways for you to explain things in a group, especially if you're talking about website usage. I don't know about you, but I don't tend to use a website in a group of people. I tend to use one by myself. So talking about using a website with a group of people is a little awkward at times. And you often can't get as much depth because you're hearing from multiple people. That takes a lot of time, and you have less time to drill down deeper with one person or one topic in a deep way. And there is not anonymity. Despite trying to create that safe space, people are not completely anonymous. Others in the group knows who said what. And this can affect their comfort level and their behavior in that group dynamic, especially if you're talking about sensitive topics. And again, there's going to be some varied participation. Some people will naturally talk more than others. So you might not be getting as much data as you think. So I'm going to be frank with you. As you may have guessed, I'm not a huge fan of focus groups. So when considering this type of method, really weigh the pros and cons. And I think if you really analyze what you want to learn, a lot of the time you're going to get richer data through one-on-one interviews rather than a focus group. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the whole UX process of interviewing participants. And as you can see here, this is a high-level overview of conducting interviews. And the steps are as follows. First, you need to understand the problem you're trying to solve. What is your research initiative? What do you want to learn? Then you want to determine the goals and objectives of what the research is for. Draft a research plan, and you're likely going to circulate that with your group and your team to get some buy-in. You need to determine what questions you're going to ask and write out your interview discussion guide. Then you're going to need to recruit participants. Either you're going to recruit them yourself or you might need an agency. And then you're actually going to conduct the interview. After that, you're going to analyze the data, and then you're going to share the findings and insights and the recommendations with your team. So I want to note something here. Conducting the interview, the actual interview, is only a small part of this process. And why? Because in order for you to conduct great interviews, there's a lot of prep that you should do to set yourself up for success. So I want to talk about a kickoff meeting for a second, and not exactly what you see here in this picture, American football. No, I'm talking about the kickoff is that initial meeting where you're sitting with stakeholders together and you're talking about what this project's going to be. And so for the kickoff, we're going to focus on what happens when your team's talking about user research. And when you're in that kickoff, you want to surface the following information. Like I said, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Hopefully, they're not just focused on features and you want to make sure it's not about, we want to learn if they'll use this feature. We want to focus on the user and make the team think about what problem are they trying to solve, not how they might be adding to feature bloat. And what's the motivation for this project? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this now? Who is the target audience that we should interview? What do we need to learn from them? Who are they? What are the team assumptions? And you might not call them assumptions, but if you ask some questions, you're going to surface some assumptions. So you would ask them, what do we know about our users? What do we know about this problem? What do we know about our product already? Some of this might be based on facts or previous research, but a lot of time it's based on assumptions. So I think it's really helpful if they do make these statements to ask for some resources and data to back it up. just so you know where things stand, what might be assumptions and what might be based on previous research. And is there any other previous research on this to that point? Or maybe another department's done some research on this that's related. You can also review quantitative data that's related to the problem. Perhaps they've learned about the what, now they want to understand about the why. And then you need to determine the best research method. I don't think the group of stakeholders should be doing this, but I surface this here because you need to make sure as the researcher that you get the information that you need to make the decision as to what is the best research method. You, the UX pro, should determine the best method for figuring out what the problem is you're trying to solve and to learn about that. This really shouldn't be done by committee. You're the expert, you should know. And finally, determine the scope. What is and is not going to be covered in this research. You want to get those timelines down and establish what's not in scope for this effort. It's really important. And so now that you have all the data that you need to initiate the research, let's talk about how to get that all into a research plan. So for me, I think the most important thing and very often overlooked for a successful interview is determining your goals and objectives. I know it sounds obvious. Of course, we know what we want to learn, but do we? I think you'd be surprised how much this varies across your team. In fact, you might not really have a great idea of the data that comes out at the end if you don't have that goal going in. Because you want that goal to get that buy-in from your team and make sure you're all aligned and on the same page. So I think it's a critical part of your research plan. You must indicate what you want to learn from this research. So what is the objective? Well, it states the goals and it acts as a North Star for your research effort. It determines if this is the right method. If you think about it thoroughly, what you want to learn, you might determine that a different method could be better than interviews. So think about that. And then you ladder up your questions to that goal. Make sure that most of your questions are directly helping you answer what that goal is. Not all of them have to, but you really want them to ladder up to what are we trying to learn. And the beauty of this is that it keeps the interview focused and avoids scope creep. And you think scope creep can't happen in an interview? Oh, yes, it can. Just start telling people that you're going to conduct an interview and they'll have all kind of add-ons and suggestions and additional questions that they want you to ask. Hey, can you also ask them blah, blah, blah? Well, maybe. So if you get consensus and make sure that you're meeting everybody, all the stakeholders' goals too, and avoid that scope creep. It also gets alignment around the research method among them as well. Okay, so now you see the importance of having a strong objective. And now let's take a minute to talk about what a research plan is. And you guessed it, it's your plan of what type of research method you're going to use. And it's pretty simple. Getting this down in writing is really critical for you to get that buy-in. So I know what you're thinking. Oh, do I really have to, Jen? It takes so much time to write a research plan out. Well, I'm going to come back and say, yes, you do. Really, though, a research plan not only gets you, the researcher, organized and prepared for success, it maps out what you plan to do, how you're going to do it, and gets everyone on the same page for that buy-in. And in some ways, it's a cover your butt kind of thing to make sure that everybody's aligned. You'll have it all in writing, and you won't get anybody coming back to you and say, oh, I thought you were going to do a focus group. Nope, that's not what this research plan said. So if it's not in your research plan, it's not in scope. And this can act as a protective shield later. I've been there. So just a warning. You'll have a document to show, yes, this is what we thought this is what we all agreed upon and moving forward. And if they feel like your research didn't cover what they wanted, well, you can say, oh, great, well, we'll be able to cover some of that in the next round of research. Okay, so now you know the importance of a research plan. What is this thing actually? Well, here are the major components that you might consider putting in your research plan. You do want to keep it brief, but make it thorough and include the following components: an overview, which is the summary of the effort, any necessary background information, so that's brief context necessary for understanding. Why are we doing this? How this relates to what we've done in the past. What is your goal and objectives? This is a must. Don't forget this. Who are the key stakeholders? It's okay. I think it's good to kind of list in who's involved and what part of the project they need to be informed, what they need, who needs to review it, and who needs to give blessing. Understand that who plays what in this game. Who are your participants? Not their names necessarily, but the type of people you're going to interview. What is the scope? What is and what is not going to be covered in this research effort? And talk about the method very briefly, why you're doing it and why that's beneficial. Don't assume people understand the value of one-on-one interviews. It's okay to remind them. And what's the timeline? How long is this effort going to take? Recruiting participants, conducting interviews, analyzing data, sharing it out. Give a high-level summary of those expectations. If they think that if you need 3 weeks and they think they're going to get 3 days, that's not good. So let them know how long things are going to take. And then I sometimes include a few interview questions. Maybe, maybe not. That's totally up to you. You're not so much seeking their input on what questions to ask. That's your job as the researcher to know what questions to ask. But you want to show them so that they can see how those questions ladder up directly to your goals. And so the example you see here on the right is a more streamlined research plan. So if you're pressed for time and wanted to record the bare minimum, if nothing else, I think you should have the goal and objectives, the participants, the type of people you're going to have, the method you're going to use, maybe some deliverables is another thing that you could include, so that they know what to expect from this research effort. And again, the timeline. And so hopefully this will be enough context to inform the team, get that consensus, and set those expectations. So when it comes to your research plan, here's the bottom line. You want to understand what you want to learn from your research so that you're asking the right questions. And this is how your questions ladder up to your goals and objectives. Kind of see how that works? Okay, so you've got the research plan down. Let's talk about the meat and potatoes of what we're actually going to do. Let's talk about the script that you were going to use as your guide and your interview. And that's what's called a discussion guide, moderator's guide, research protocol. Yeah, kind of all the same thing. I want to talk about the pieces that should go into your discussion guide. And this is the overall structure of what you're going to say and the questions you're going to ask. Now, I like to include my introductory language in the discussion guide. Exactly what I'm going to say, introducing myself, that sort of thing, but that's not required. Some people are more loose and don't include that. See what you're most comfortable with. So in the introduction, as the interviewer, you talk about who you are, why you're doing this, who will see the information from this interview, and the instructions on what you're going to do today. Also, let them know that they can end the interview at any time. Then you want to build that rapport, set them at ease, and get to know them a little bit. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And I recommend that you start with broad, general questions and let them guide you. Then follow up with more specific probing questions about the topic that you want to learn more about. So here's an example of starting out broad. You want to learn if they are okay with buying an item online with a credit card. That's your ultimate goal. First, ask them to tell you about the last time they bought something online. Listen to their story. Have them tell you about the experience and pay attention to the details around that payment method. And then you follow up with questions specifically about that checkout or that payment experience that they started to talk about. You want to dive in deeper into that to get more details. And it's kind of good to do it after they mention it because it feels more natural. It feels like a natural conversation. It was their idea. Now they're going to talk about it. So see how being broad starts that conversation and then guides to what you want to learn more about. And it doesn't bias them. And they're going to be more willing to talk because it kind of seems like their idea to talk about in the first place. So again, start with general questions, but use those deep dive probing questions to get it on the specific details. And when writing out your guide, you need to determine those nice to have or those optional questions and those must have questions. Now, I know you want to ask all the things, but some people are really chatty and you will not be able to get to everything. So make sure you have those critical must have questions first. And then you can revisit the nice to have questions if you have time. And speaking of time, you might have to time box and devote a certain amount of time to a certain segment of questions. And this will help you stay on schedule and help you make sure that you're getting those critical questions answered. And then wrap up with a closing question. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And finally, thank them for their time. Give them their incentive if you haven't done that already, or if the recruiter doesn't do that for you. And send them on their merry way with a smile. So the bottom line here is you want to treat your discussion guide not as a checklist of everything that you need to go through. It really is a guide, hence the name. But you want to make sure that you are meeting your main goal and objectives with those must-have questions that you ask along the way. So before you actually conduct the interviews, there are a few things I want you to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to talk about some tips to consider, but I'm not going to do a deep dive into these subjects here because this would be a whole nother talk and it'd keep you here for 6 hours, and we don't want to do that. But I just want to briefly point out some things for consideration when you're setting up for success. So make sure you define your target audience for the interview. Know who you need to talk to. And this is more of a way so that you can craft your questions to the right kind of person. Understand your participants so that you know that you're asking them the right questions. And determine if you're going to do the recruiting yourself or you're going to pay a recruiter to find your participants for you. But either way, you're going to need a screener that gets the right participants in for your study. And it rules out people who are not your ideal candidates for the interview at this time. So those are going to vary by study. I can't tell you what to put in a screener right now, but that's something you're definitely going to need to craft as part of your interview. And have some extra time to schedule participants. Coordinating people with their calendars, especially if you can't see their calendars, takes more time than you think. So give yourself some time to do that. Pilot, test, and iterate. I'm going to say never go into your first interview without practicing this once or twice first. I always find questions that need tweaked and refined in these practice rounds, always. And it's okay to do it with a coworker. That's okay. So you're not only testing the questions, but you're also trying to make sure the question is going to gather the right information that you intended to. Sometimes you think that you ask a question and then the person interprets it differently. So you need to tweak sometimes to make sure that that question is interpreted the way you want it to be. And about getting that consent, again, this might be done in advance. This might be done on the day of the interview. It's a really important topic, but a little too much for today's talk. And then we'll be remote or in person. Some people are heading back into the workplace now that COVID's kind of winding down, thank goodness. So consider how a little bit of the logistics around how you're going to conduct that interview. And talking, so Talking about logistics, let's talk about that a little bit because this is important. So how are you going to take notes? Are you going to be the only person in the interview and therefore you have to take your own notes? Or can you have another person or two help you taking notes? You need to determine this in advance. My recommendation is to have another person or two, if you can, to be there to help take notes for you. Make sure they're good note takers, right? A lot of things, that's really important. Have them record not just what's said, but reactions and body language too. This is important to know. So for me, I often take my own notes and I have a note taker. Even when I'm moderating, I still take my own notes. I can't help it. I take really good notes. So I want to make sure that my perspective is captured as well. And then you're going to determine the setting up of the note taking, right? So are you going to use an electronic format or are you going to use pen and paper? If it's electronic, what program are you going to use? If you're taking notes with another person, are you each going to have a copy of the questions and the notes on your own computer? Or are you going to share some kind of online spreadsheet or something? So when I take notes, I have an online spreadsheet like Excel or Google, and the online version, like in the browser. I have the questions in the first column. I have the second column is for me to take notes in as we go down through the questions. The third column is for my other note taker to take notes in as we go down through the questions. And then the fourth column is for the note taker and myself to communicate. So we will put in, like, the note taker might say, hey, I didn't understand that. Can you follow up with this? And then I'll follow up with a follow-up question based on what the note taker has asked me to do. It's just easier for us to communicate in that spreadsheet because we're there, we're already typing. It's hard to look at Slack or Teams or some other form when you're already in this document. So that's what I found has been easier for me to do. But there's times when other people who are not in that document are also observing, maybe taking their own notes, and you need to maybe get some follow-up questions or some feedback from them. So determine how that's going to be. Are you going to be in Slack? Are you going to be in Teams? Are we going to text you on your cell phone? I tend to not have a lot of people observing my research because I find it to be intimidating. So I like to keep it small and limited. So generally I'll communicate with the people in that spreadsheet, but if I am having additional people, I'll keep a side eye on Slack or chat or Teams or some other kind of communication, real-time communication device. And finally, say the participant's name. It builds that rapport and it kind of confirms that you know who you're talking to. So I like to have their name big on red and at the top and kind of get into the practice of saying their names a few times. So you want to figure out your setup, your computer setup ahead of time. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of options so that you have something to consider. So what you see here, me again, if you are only on one computer. So I'm on a laptop in this scenario, right? No additional monitors, just one. So I put the zoom at the top so that because I'm using my in-computer camera, and I put the zoom at the top so I'm making eye contact as much as possible because that's really important. And then I have my discussion guide or my notes right below that and typing as I'm talking to them. Does that make sense? Yeah, hopefully. Okay. So this is one computer. I'm the only person taking notes. No one else is here with me. Now, if it is, I got the multiple compute monitor setup going on here, which is what I have right now, actually. I'm sitting at this very same scenario. I have a tea over here. Let me take a quick sip. Different class, same kind of thing. So here's how I have this set up if I have multiple monitors. On the left, I have the internet in the background, just in case I need to look up something pretty quickly. I have my discussion guide. This is let's say it's a browser version of a spreadsheet, and the questions are in the first column. I'm writing in the second column, and my note taker is in the third column. Now I'll tell the participant, hey, I'm looking over here from time to time because this is where my notes are. but it's all about you. I just want you to know I'm looking over here from time to time. And again, I keep the Zoom, the monitor at the top, close to my camera, which is pointing at my monitor here, like you can see. It is at the top of the monitor on my laptop. That's where my camera is. So I keep that close. So I'm making eye contact as much as possible. And then I might have some additional notes underneath there if I need to. And then on my right hand monitor is where I have additional communication. If my team needs to communicate with me via email or on Teams is what I happen to have now. That's the way that I have this set up. So this is just optional. Nobody has to do this. This doesn't make me any happier or better. Just sharing some options with you so that you have something to think about. So has anyone here heard the phrase of Murphy's Law? I'm guessing yes. Yes, it's the law states that if something can go wrong, it will. And this certainly applies to technology. Happens to me all the time. So you need to be prepared. And so here's some ways to be prepared. You need to have extra headphones in case your headphones die or they break. So just have an extra set right here handy just in case. And you also need to have some backup technology in case something crashes. So what if your Zoom goes out? How can you call video that person again? Google Hangout, FaceTime, Teams. Know what your plan B is in case you get disconnected on your video. What if you're disconnected completely and you can't get back into video? What is a way that your participant and you can communicate? Or they get disconnected, right? Things happen. Internet goes down. I sometimes will give my participant my cell phone number. So I say, hey, if we get disconnected, just text me. And the good thing about having just a cell phone is you can always call back and just do the video, the interview over audio, if that's possible. And so I will give my phone number in case of dire emergencies, or my email. You know, I can often still get my email on my phone. We can communicate that way and work around those technological glitches. And you know what? If all else fails, power goes out, go old school. Call them up on the phone, have that pen and paper ready to go, take some notes. So as a backup, have your discussion guide printed out just in case as an emergency. And I have another pro tip for you. Make sure you pad in some time in between participants. Always do that. Technology makes things spill over sometimes and things take longer than you think. So give yourself a break, debrief, exhale, get a drink of water, pad in some extra time. Don't do them back to back. It's not healthy. Whew. Okay. A lot about preparing for success, but I think it's really important for you to have some of these tips and tricks in your toolkit, even before conducting interviews. And now that you understand the pros and cons of conducting interviews, the importance of having a research plan and discussion guide, why Jen is not a big fan of focus groups, and why you shouldn't be either. I think you have what you need to be set up for success. So woohoo. Okay. Now, let's move on and talk about you. Let's talk about your role as the facilitator of these one-on-one interviews. How should you conduct yourself? How do you build rapport? And I'm going to talk about 2 interview questions that Jen never wants you to ask in an interview. So let's move on and talk about your role as the person conducting the interview. One of your top roles is to set the scene. Get that participant to feel safe and comfortable. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. First, smile. I hate it when people tell me to smile. But it really is the fastest way to make a connection with someone. I mean, don't be super fake, but smile at the participant and let them feel liked. You don't want them to think that you don't like them or that they're wasting your time. So smile. Make eye contact. Don't have your camera up here in awkward situations. Make eye contact as much as you can because that builds connections. You want to create safety. And you do this in the instructions when you're getting that informed consent. Tell them there are no right or wrong answers, who will have access to the data, and how that data is going to be used. And now that you've created that safe space, the next thing you want to do is build that rapport. And you can do this through body language, through having a nice voice tone, and using nonverbal clues like smiling and eye contact. And so to start to build that rapport, you can engage in some small talk. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And finally, your participant is looking for you to guide the discussion today. You want to design a flow in your questions that seems like a natural conversations. But it's still going to, you still want to get to your goals and objectives, but make it feel natural and just casual. So I want to talk about, let's take a second to talk about some of the things that you should not do. Don't be weird. People want to engage with people who are normal, friendly, and not have a hidden agenda. So be human. Make the entire situation less intimidating by being relatable, courteous, respectful, but not their best friend. So don't get too casual, but don't get weird. And you are here to learn from the participant, so let them be your guide. Don't correct them if they're wrong. Don't correct them if they use a different word for something than you would. That's actually really cool because now you've learned a little bit about their mental model and the terms that they use. So don't correct them if they say the wrong word. My goal here is like, let them be the expert, not you. So play kind of dumb. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And you are here to listen and to learn from them. You're not here to talk. So in the US, maybe many of you know her, Judge Judy is this TV judge, this personality. And she has this phrase where she says, God gave you one mouth and two ears for a reason. And that is so that you listen more and speak less. So practice active listening, observe their body language if you can see them. And don't inject your own stories and examples. And don't try to fill awkward silence with your voice. Just basically shut the heck up. So I want to take a moment to talk about how you can be an apprentice to learn more from the person you're interviewing. So what's an apprentice? Well, an apprentice is a person who learns a trade or craft by shadowing, following, observing a skilled professional in a trade. In other words, it's on-the-job training by someone who's been working in the field for a really long time. And they teach the apprentice firsthand how to do the job. It has a long history. It's been mentioned back in like the 18th century BC in Babylonian manuscripts. And what often happens is, excuse me, the skilled worker teaches the apprentice how to do the job by showing how to do the job, even maybe letting the apprentice do some hands-on training, and then the professional observes and corrects a little bit. Yeah, Jen, what's this got to do with a UX interview? Has Jen lost her mind or something? No. The point here is that when you are conducting interviews, you need to take on that apprentice role. So let's talk about why this is so important and why it is so effective. By handing over the power and the expertise over to your participant, this shapes the relationship and therefore their comfort level in talking to you. Basically, it shifts the power to them. Now they are the expert and they're in control. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You want that person to feel comfortable and talking so that you can learn. People love to talk. So by making them the expert, they're going to share their knowledge with you. Plus, in a sense, assigning that role of the expert professional to the participant makes them feel smart. And when they feel smart, it establishes trust and they feel more comfortable opening up to you. So what does this look like? Well, you simply play dumb. Use phrases like, I'm not exactly sure. Can you tell me more about that? I might know a little bit about that, but I also might be wrong. So why don't you tell me? I'm pretty new to this. Perhaps you can tell me. Again, you want to shift the power. You're acting as the apprentice, learning from the expert. And your interview participant is the skilled person that's trying to give you that on-the-job training. Let them win. Let them show you how super smart they are. So now that you understand how to approach an interview by being the apprentice in the relationship, let's talk about some additional ways to set that dynamic between you and your participant to avoid bias and share just about the right information, but not revealing too much. I want to talk about some things that you want to cover when you're giving instructions and the clarity about what that interview will entail. So this is that introduction part that we talked about of the discussion guide. So for example, we're going to talk about how you shop online today. That could be some context. Not, I want you to tell me how you use your debit card to buy things on XYZ's company website. The problem here is you named the company and you named a method of payment. Now their mindset is all about how they feel about that company, and they're primed to talk about a specific experience rather than a broader behavior. Tell them how long you expect the interview to last and respect that. It's your job to keep the pace and honor the time scheduled for that interview. Don't go longer. It's not their fault if they don't get to all the questions. It happens a lot, but still you need to respect their time. And remind them that there are no right or wrong answers. You're just gathering the info and you want honest information. You do not want to be pleased. People tend to want to please others, but let them know it's okay to provide negative feedback. In fact, you like it. And don't overwhelm them with having too many people observing the call. We talked about this a little bit. I find it to be quite intimidating. And that's why I said maybe 1 or 2 people helping you take notes. If other people on the team want to see it, just record it and let them see it later. Also, let them know who else is on the call. Just be transparent as the person giving the interview. I have 1 or 2 people on here taking notes. Let them know that. And that brings me to my last point. Get explicit permission to record. Tell the participant who will have access to the recording, and not only the people on the team will see it, but you're going to protect their anonymity. Just let them know. So sometimes I try to keep the situation light by say, are you okay with us recording today's session? Don't worry, it's not going to be in the next Super Bowl commercial. Usually gets a little chuckle out of them. And so I want to wrap up about your role as an interviewer by talking about how important it is to remain neutral. And it's important that you acknowledge that you hear them without being too happy about it, in a sense, right? So has anyone ever heard of the observer expectancy effect or the pleasing effect? Well, what happens is your behavior as the interviewer can affect the participant. If you're too positive, their behavior can also become too positive, and they want to reciprocate that positive behavior and please you. See how that might work? So it's important to be courteous, but not too happy or excited or positive. So you can say things like, I see, I got it, okay, I hear you, thanks for sharing. Don't say things like, wow, that's exciting, I love that, that's awesome. Even without the crazy Jen enthusiasm, let's try not to use those over enthusiastic phrases. Just by saying something like, thanks for that, you acknowledge that you hear them without getting them too excited or feeling the need to please you. But I mean, it's okay to say it with a smile. Just keep it neutral. So we talked a little bit about building rapport, and I want to revisit this because it can make or break an interview. And so how do you quickly build a rapport with your participant? Well, let me first say, I don't think you should be doing what's going on in this photo and hugging your participant. That would be weird. So no, that's not the kind of rapport that I'm talking about. Establishing a first good impression and good rapport is probably one of the most important things that you'll do as an interviewer. And you want to set that comfort. And this goes back to setting that scene, setting expectations by instructing them on what will be done with the data, who's going to see it, what you're going to do in today's session. Set the scene. If you're remote, I would suggest that you still be on video, even if they're not. Let them see that you are making eye contact with them. And people feel comfortable. That it makes them feel comfortable and they say more. So take on to that apprentice role to try to get that more information. Let the tone of the product or the topic that you're talking about drive the formality of the interview. So if you are working for a financial institution, you want to keep the conversation professional and probably a bit more formal. People are nervous about talking about their finances, so don't make it a joke. And it's okay to use common language to get the person to feel more comfortable. This should go without saying, but don't use technical jargon with your participant. Nothing makes a person feel bad and dumb faster than using words and abbreviations they don't understand. This will shut them up like a clam, so just don't do it. So let's talk about some specific ways that you can build rapport with your participant. Like I said before, smile, even if you're on the phone. It comes through on audio calls too. Introduce yourself. Say your name, your role, and what you're going to be doing today. Call the person by name to build that human connection. And start with some small talk. How was your day so far? Have you participated in research before? If it's in person, ask, how was the drive over? Or if it's remote, what's the weather like where you are? Small talk shows shared humanity and experience, but you don't want to get too personal. So don't comment on a person's appearance or ethnicity or anything like that. Keep it neutral. And if you're in person, pay attention to body language. Are they asking for distance? If they're stepping back or leaning back, then you should not move in as a participant. Give them that physical space that they're asking for through their body language. And finally, I want to talk about mirroring. And it's such an instinctive behavior that we often don't even know we're doing it. We mimic or mirror or replicate behaviors that we see. If someone scratches their nose, many of us will do it too. If we adjust their hair, we do it too. Mirroring builds connections with others, and you can use this to your advantage. If the participant leans in, you can too. If the participant folds their hands under their chin, you can do it too. I mean, don't do it every time and don't be weird about it, but just be aware how this phenomenon of mirroring can help you build a connection with your participant. Okay, so there's this question that we've heard. It's often a natural way to start an interview with, tell me about yourself. I'm sure you probably have heard this question, heard that this is a great way to start things off. Well, let's talk about that question for a second. And yes, we know that people love talking about themselves, and that's a great way to build rapport. It's a good icebreaker. And the problem is that this question can really open a can of worms. First, what are they going to talk about? Is it relevant to what you want to learn from them today? Do you have potentially 10 or 15 minutes for them to spend on just this one question? So this question, you need to be careful because it can be a huge time suck and it may not get you relevant information that you want. Instead, think about how you might narrow down this question. You want to get them talking about themselves, but not on some random topic that you really don't need to learn about. So here's an example. As I mentioned before, we're going to talk about an online shopping experience. Tell me about the last time you bought something online. Here's another example. From your job title, I see that you're a legal secretary. Very briefly, can you tell me a couple of items that you do in a given week? And along that same line, when we ask about a person's job or their role, I like to rephrase this. This is probably one of my favorite ways to phrase that "what do you do" question. Say, talk to me like I'm a 10-year-old and tell me what you do here at this company. And the reason why I like this question is because it makes them chuckle thinking about having to explain this to a 10-year-old. And that builds rapport. People who have a 10-year-old totally get it. And they know that they shouldn't go into the weeds and they know that they need to keep it simple. And hopefully it simplifies their language. Again, keeping them out of the weeds and not too technical. And what it does, it moves people away from job titles and it actually has them go into what they do, not what their title is. So another way I address this job role question is to acknowledge that sometimes titles are strange. And so the question would be, I see that you're an engineer. Well, sometimes titles are strange and we don't really know what that person does. Can you tell me what you do in your job? So no, I'm not asking them to clarify their job title. I'm asking them to tell me what they do. By first pointing out that you know what their title is and saying that titles are strange, it does a number of things in your favor. First, it evens the playing field. It makes you safe for not knowing what their title means. And hopefully it simplifies their description a bit when they talk to you. And again, this often makes them chuckle because they too can relate to some people having strange job titles and not really knowing what they are. So my main point is you want to nail this introductory question well. And you do so, if you do so, you're making a huge leap into building that rapport and getting at really valuable information from your participant. Now, mean, bad Jen's going to come in here for a second. I'm going to crush your dreams. Are you ready for a buzzkill? All right, let's look at a quote. Steve Portugal, who's a prominent UX researcher, said, "There is a difference between what you want to know and what you ask." All right, so what does that mean? Well, you can't always ask a direct question and get a direct answer. And I think this applies to two very specific questions. Do you like this? And will you use this? Let's talk about that first question that Jen hates so much from a UX research perspective. Do you like this? Who cares? No, just kidding. Really though, your stakeholders are going to ask you to ask this question. If they haven't done so in your career yet, you just wait. They're going to do it. Do you like this? Well, here's a couple reasons why I hate this question. People lie, and they suffer from optimism bias. I mean, people don't mean to lie to you. They want to make you happy. You asked them to come in to participate in some research. In fact, you might be paying them to be there. So naturally, they want to tell you that they like something. They want to please you. But don't be fooled. People are not great at articulating their true preferences. Again, it goes back to wanting to please you. So that's what I don't like about this. Do you like this question? But here are some ways that you can get around asking this and get some additional info that is going to avoid that optimism bias. Ask them things like, what things do you use to do this now? What things do you not use to get this done? How usable is this product? No, I said usable, not likable. Big difference. What works well or not so well with this product? The bottom line is that understanding current behaviors and even preferences is a better indicator of what they guess they will like, because that's what it is. It's a guess. In other words, people simply cannot tell you if they would be likely to use something with any amount of validity. Now, let me talk about my second least favorite question in a UX interviewer, and that is, will you use this? And like on the previous question, people can't predict the future and people lie. So I want to tell you a story about a yellow Walkman, which is what you see in this picture. And a Walkman is something that people used back, I don't know, probably late 80s, early 90s, before smartphones, to listen to music portably. So they would put in headphones, plug it into this thing, play a cassette tape, and listen to music. And so Sony, the company that makes Walkmans, had people come in to participate in some research. And as an incentive, before the research, they asked him, would you like a yellow Walkman or a black Walkman as a thank you for participating today? Almost everybody said they wanted the yellow Walkman. So they go through the research, and when they come out the other end, they get to pick up which Walkman they want to take with them as a thank you. And almost everybody picked up the black Walkman. So the moral of the story is, you can't rely on what people say they will do, but you can rely on what they actually do. So instead of asking them to predict behavior, ask about previous and current behavior. Ask questions like, what is your current situation? And what you're trying to find out is, does this even lead to using a product like this? Ask, when was the last time you did this? Tell me about that. Again, you're trying to find out if they've done this or used this before. And if they haven't, why not? And if a person is doing whatever activity, what advice would you give them? And so when you ask that question, what you're doing is you're looking to find out what's important to that person, what is valuable to them, and what advice they would share on using that product. So another kind of predict the future question workaround I've heard is, how much money would you spend on this? And yeah, this question can reveal how important, say, buying a product or service is. If it's really valuable, the idea is they'll tell you that they're ready and willing to spend money on it. But I think that you should take this question with a grain of salt, because you're still asking them to predict the future. They're not really putting money in your hand right now. All right, okay. Enough about wallowing in negativity. Let's revisit some of the UX interview process for a second. So up to this point, we covered a lot about the UX interview process. Knowing what problem to solve, the research guide, the discussion guide. And I want to point out that conducting the interview is actually really just a small part in this whole process. And that's why I spent so much time on preparing and the tips and tricks for success. And so now that we got that covered, let's talk about the actual interview. I want to go into some interview questions that are actually pretty valuable. And let's talk about how magical you can make your next UX interview questions. So there are a lot of ways that you can pull that magic artiste brush out and craft your UX interview questions to get to those deeper insights. So here's a list. And now let's dive into each one. So I've talked about this, but what makes for great interview questions is to start broad and then narrow in. So let's go back to that shopping example. You would ask, tell me how you shop online. And then you let them tell you about that. you listen to the part where they get to the payment method, and then you would follow up and said, you mentioned a debit card. Tell me about that. Neutralize your questions. We don't want them to be loaded or biased, and we're going to get rid of the judgment in our questions. So here's an example. It's what I don't want you to do. Why don't you understand what to do next? Ouch. Instead, say, what do you think you would do next? Asking for a typical example, I love this. This helps you understand their typical behavior. Help people remember by asking them about a specific time rather than a general process. So you would say, tell me about the last time you bought something online. And similar to that is something called the critical incident report. And you ask them to tell you about a very good experience or a very bad experience specifically. Ask them something like, tell me about the last time your computer crashed when you were saving a document. Well, computer crashes are pretty traumatic. So hopefully they'll be able to recall a lot of details in that extreme scenario. And I want you to go in with no assumptions. So what you would not say is, what works well about this website? Well, that assumes something does work well about that website. So instead, I'm going to teach you a key phrase. I love this phrase, inject if anything. And that removes the assumptions immediately. So instead, you would say, what, if anything, works well about this website? Again, don't assume anything works well. So by putting that if anything in there, that removes that assumption. This is a huge pro tip. Write this down. If anything. Great. And I want to address this idea that it's a common piece of advice people get, and they say, don't ever ask close-ended questions. So only ask open-ended questions. Well, an open-ended question, what is that? Well, first of all, it's questions that require more than one word answer. So it's more than a yes or no or a number or something very specific. Those are close-ended questions. So an example of a closed question would be, do you use a credit card to pay online? Well, the answer is going to be either yes or no. So the problem with closed questions is that's the end, but you want more. So it's okay to ask a few closed-ended questions, but as long as you follow up for more context. So like here, you could ask, do you use a credit card? And your follow-up would be, tell me more about that. Get that additional details. But let's talk about an example that would be even better. Instead, you could say, what do you use to pay for a purchase online? And then they give you the answer. Let's say they say PayPal or a credit card. So look what happened there. You learned about another mode of payment. You learned about PayPal, which you weren't asking about before. You were going to only ask about the credit card, and that would have boxed them into that answer. They may have never even told you about PayPal, but now you know about both. And you can ask follow-up questions about both. See the difference? So along the same lines, I want to talk about giving them options. It's kind of similar. If possible, don't give them options. Let them tell you. So don't say, do you use a credit card or a debit card for online purchases? Instead, you could say, what do you use to pay for your online purchases? Keeping it open, not giving them options. Like before, by asking this, you might learn about other modes of payment that they may not have told you if you'd already just given the options. So this is why I say, like, keep them broad and let them give you the options, and then you can explore those options deeper. And back to that like apprentice model we talked about earlier, ask dumb questions. It's okay if you don't know something. Ask for clarification. Learn from the expert, your participant. So for example, you could say, I'm not sure what that means. Can you tell me more? You might very well know what that means, but you want to hear their version of what that means. Really important. And so when you're asking questions, also ask about how they feel about things when it's appropriate. Don't assume you know how they feel based on what they told you. A simple follow-up with saying, tell me how you feel about that, can be a wealth of knowledge. I can't tell you how many times I thought about like that I understood how they feel, but then when I asked them, I was actually pretty far off. So it's good to find out how they feel. And what I really like about that is then you can take those insights back to your team. You can build empathy for your team, for your participant by telling them how they feel about something. And it often shatters assumptions. So it's a really good tactic. And also we've hinted about this all through today's talk, follow-ups. I love them. Let's dive into those. Yes, follow-ups. So I think follow-ups, probing questions are your secret sauce to success in an interview. If you just ask a question and don't understand the answer, ask follow-up questions. You need more follow-up questions. Your goal as a UX researcher is to make sure you understand what the question means and get all the way down into that, really know. Sometimes follow-up questions are needed in order to do that. And so I'm going to talk about a few of my favorite follow-ups, but I want to point out, like, keep them neutral. And it's okay to kind of play confused a little bit, like that apprentice, to keep that participant talking. So here are some of my favorite follow-ups. Tell me more about that. Tell me why you think that way. Tell me why it's done that way. Tell me why that is the case. That seems important to you. Is that correct? Why is that? That seems negative for you. Is that right? Tell me more about that. And then, can you explain that a bit further? Here's some more great follow-ups that I just love. I think I heard you say whatever the word is. Did I get that right? So for example, I think I heard you say you were not a fan of Cocoa Puffs. Is that right? Can you give me an example? I'm not sure I'm with you. Can you explain that a little bit more? Walk me through how that goes. And then my favorite tactic is rephrase and repeat. So this is a really fun technique. You take the last few words, usually about 3 words or so, and repeat them back to them as a question. So they say, I would never use this type of payment. You, as the interviewer, says back, this type of payment? Or here's another example. They say, I find this whole thing really tough to navigate. And you say back to them, tough to navigate? They're going to feel the need to clarify when you sling back that in the form of a question. See how that works? It's really a great tactic. So pack this in your arsenal. It's really good stuff. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story. I was working at a company that owns a bunch of animal hospitals. This was my first week on the job as a UX researcher and a designer, and they asked me to sit in a focus group phone call. I already know how Jen feels about that, but that's not the worst of it. This call was 50 doctors and technicians on this call. And the product owner, Dennis, said, here's the new pet dashboard. Isn't it great? What do you think? Isn't it great? Well, that's certainly going to bias the group a little bit, and it's going to get them to want to please him with happy answers, isn't it? So what's wrong with what Dennis said? Well, all kinds of things. And I want to talk about what went wrong with that and some of the things that Jen doesn't want you to do. So I'm going to put my bossy britches on again and lecture you about some of the things that you should not be doing in your UX interviews. I'm going to walk you through some not so great techniques that could slip into your UX interviews. But now you're going to learn about them and you're going to be able to successfully keep them out. Things like leading, confirmation bias, assumptions, priming. So let's dive into these. Quick sip. Priming is like planting a seed, and it gets the person thinking about what you just stated. So be careful. And priming is closely related to the idea of don't think about what I'm going to talk about now. Then you say it and everybody thinks about it. So if I said, don't think about unicorns sliding down a rainbow, I would put $100 on that you're thinking about unicorns and rainbows now. That's priming. So here's an example. I'm going to ask you some tough questions. Oof. How do you think that person feels? My guess is they're pretty nervous and they don't want to get the answers wrong. So instead, you could ask them, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Don't freak them out. Keep it neutral. So leading is guiding a person toward a thought or response and kind of priming them with that seed. So here's an example. I love to go on walks, long walks in the evening. How do you feel about long walks? Well, who's going to say they don't like long walks now after that person just said that they like them? No one. It's weird. Instead, how do you feel about long walks? You don't need to tell them how you, the interviewer, feels about walks. Just ask the question. So let's say I have a pretty strong opinion about something and I want other people to agree with me. I can try confirmation bias and word things in a way to get people to agree with me. Here's one. What's wrong with this? Well, who said anything was wrong with this? And this is a classic example of where you're inserting your opinion and expecting people to confirm it. Instead of what's wrong with this, you would ask, what are your thoughts on this? So here's an example. A minute ago, you said you would never ride a motorcycle. What about riding a scooter? Well, now the participant's thinking about what they said earlier, and they don't want to look like a liar. And you just anchor them to think about that thing that they said earlier. And now their train of thought is tied to that initial statement. You said you didn't like to ride a motorcycle. So instead of that, putting that initial, you didn't like a motorcycle statement in the front, you could say, how do you feel about riding a scooter? You don't need to mention what they said before. If they want to, they can tie it back to what they said about the motorcycle. Let them do that, not you. Assumptions, talked about this quite a bit tonight. Assuming a person has a reaction or feeling about something is not what we want to do. So here's the question. How angry were you when they got your dinner order wrong? How do we know that they were angry? This question gets the participant to start thinking about that emotion, anger. And now maybe they're less likely to talk about other emotions that they had. So instead of saying, how angry were you when they got your dinner order wrong, just ask, how did you feel when they got your dinner order wrong? And remember, we generally don't want to ask closed questions or, those one word answer kind of questions, unless we have some follow-up. So the question is, do you ride the train into work? Well, I think this is a poor question in a couple of ways. First, it's a yes, no question. Want a little bit more than that. Also, you've given them options. Do you take the train? And now you've got them primed to think about the train. And you might only get answers about the train now, unless you follow up. So instead of, do you take the train to work? I would say, how do you get to work? That broad question, let them give you the options. And we talked about this before, back to that options question, right? Do you ride a bike or scooter to work? Well, now these are the options in their brain. So instead, make it neutral and let them tell you, how do you get to work? Remove the options. Will you use this? Yep, we already talked about this. I know, but it is so important that I want to put it in here again. Nope, we're not asking this question. And here's one. Will your grandmother like this product? Who cares? How can I predict what my grandma likes accurately? No. If you want to know grandma likes something, you can ask her. But then again, we're not going to ask for preferences to see if they like something, are we? Tricky on that one. Going back to what other people's opinions. This is not really super useful because the person you're interviewing is usually not 100% accurate on the thoughts and opinions of others. So it's not really valuable to ask that. And then finally, let's look at a specific example that's a pretty poor UX question. Would you rather use this improved version of the website or stay with what's there now? Okay, so what's wrong with this? The word improved is a way to insert your opinion and bias people to answer what you're looking for. So it's confirmation bias. I'm stating my preference. It assumes that this is an improvement. It gives them suggestions and options. And you're asking for their preferences and their likes. So this is all the things wrong. So nope, let's not do this one. And finally, like I mentioned many times today, give enough context so your participant understands what you're asking, and then shut up. Let them do the talking. They don't need to hear your thoughts or your feelings or examples. Let them do it. So in an ideal world, all of your user interviews will run smoothly. We never hit rough waters, right? The participant answers your questions quickly and on point. They know exactly what you mean when you ask them. And they always stay on the subject. Well, the real world is not always smooth sailing. So let's talk about some common challenges that you might face when conducting interviews and how to navigate those. So we talked about ways that you should be communicating, but I think it's worth revisiting because sometimes problems in interviews can come from the person conducting the interview. You want to build rapport, but not a friendship. So you want to be friendly, but neutral. If you're too happy and silly, it will change the dynamic of the conversation, and you don't want to be too casual or informal. And don't talk too much. Just a reminder, shut the heck up and let the participant speak. And this ties to that too. Sure, you might have a funny story or an interesting point that aligns with what they said. Who cares? You are there to listen to them, not to talk. And I know you must be wondering, why does Jen keep telling you to shut up? Well, I say this because I have seen too many interviewers talk on and on and on. It's more common than you think. To be a master UX interviewer artiste, you must learn the valuable skill of embracing your own silence. And now that you understand how to lead the conversation naturally and keep our mouth shut as much as we can, let's talk about some common communication issues that might arise. So sometimes your participant might not speak the same language as you. or at least you don't share the same first language. So be mindful of that. Avoid slang and abbreviations and speak slowly. Similarly, avoid tech jargon and abbreviations. We talked about that, but if you can't avoid them, define them for the participant. Don't assume that your participant speaks that same industry jargon that your company does. Silence. It's awkward. It sucks. Every interviewer dreads that dead air time, but you got to let it be. Give people that extra time to collect their thoughts and to start to speak. Do not start talking just because they're not. You just need to be patient, and it's going to be worth it. And sometimes interviews can be a show and tell, and there are definitely some pros and cons to that. Showing you rather than just telling you. The good thing is you can see what they're referring to, and you're seeing it in context. So sometimes you can take some screenshots of what they're showing you and what they're doing, and you can reference those later, share them with the team. And it can prompt them to say more when they're looking at it. It reminds them of things. So they can speak to not only what they do, but they can share the feelings in that context too. But the downside is it might lead to some rabbit holes. And it might turn into a product demo. And this might not be very good use of your time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to get people back on the rails when they go down some of those rabbit holes, but I just want you to something to think about the pros and cons of a show and tell if that comes up in an interview. And finally, you want to instill confidence in your participant. You might hear phrases like, is this what you want? Is this okay? And this is the participant trying to please you. Remind them that their opinion is valuable, no matter what. And that's what you want to hear. And then there might be some participants who are not particularly nice. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're not comfortable talking about the subject. Maybe they're just a grouch. Don't let someone who's negative bring you down. Take a deep breath, smile, keep a professional facade. And if they really feel like they don't want to be there, or if they become hostile, just let them go. If someone's too distracted and they're just not willing to cooperate, it might not be worth your time to continue. So it's okay, just set them free. So I think one of the biggest challenges of interviewing is keeping people focused and on track. When someone goes off on a tangent, you just want to scream, "Oh, stop talking about that and get to my darn question." I get it, but you can't say that. You have to maintain control, and that often means polite interruption and course correct. And here are some helpful phrases that might get you to get that participant back to answering those questions at hand. So I'm going to go through some examples, and I'm going to insert the word topic. And when I say topic, what I mean is you're trying to get them back to the topic that you were asking about. So whatever that might be, when I use the word topic, you're inserting what really the topic is that you're trying to get them back, okay? Also, I'm not asking you to use all of these phrases in an interview. These are just some suggestions. You pick what feels good for you and what works in context and what feels appropriate into trying to bring them back on the rails, okay? Earlier, you said something about topic. Let's talk about that. Yes, that's an interesting thing to talk about. But let's get back to the question for a minute. That's really valuable information, but let's put that on hold for a second. I'd really like to get back to knowing more about topic at the moment. I'd love to hear more, but I also want to hear about topic. Let's move on to the next thing. I'd like to go back to topic. Let's pause on that thought for a bit and switch to you telling me more about topic. All right, I understand your thoughts on that now. Can you tell me about topic? And if they're really off the mark and kind of going on a crazy tangent, perhaps they don't understand what you're there to learn from the interview. And they're likely trying to be helpful, but you kind of need to level set so that they understand what information you're really trying to gather. So you might have to say something like, my understanding is that we were here to talk about topic. Were you thinking the same thing? Okay, great. Let's talk about that. So as you can see, if you're just reiterating that you're here to talk about topic, you can get the person back on track. I found that using one of these approaches acts like a snap, and they return to the topic that you were asking about in the first place. So before we wrap up, I just want to share a couple tricks and tips on how you might conclude your next UX interview. I want to talk about some all-encompassing and super broad questions that are a great way to wrap up an interview. I love the question, if you had a magic wand. Start with that. So if you had a magic wand, what would you change? Or if you had a magic wand, how would you like this to be? And this is a great way to really understand what's important to them, especially ideas that may not have come up in the conversation, but they think it's important to bring up. So I will admit this can be a tough question for some people to answer. It's kind of putting them on the spot a little bit. So give them a little bit of time to think about it. Sometimes that silence is golden and you get some really good stuff from this question. Also, don't be afraid to ask if there are any other people that you could talk to on the same subject. Interview participants can be great referrals, especially if they're internal employees. So ask, is there anybody else I could talk to? And then finally, is there anything else you'd like to cover that we didn't talk about today? I can't tell you how many times people will say, no, that's all, except for blah, 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 and then go into some other topic. They act like it's a no, but then they give you a little bit more. It's a topic that didn't come up in the interview, but it's still fantastic information a lot of times, and they think it's really important, so they're sharing it with you. I will say most of the time I get a no, that's all, thank you, but sometimes it's worth it just to ask this, just to get a little nugget that you didn't ask for in the interview. And it also gives the interview a good sense of closure. Whew, okay, now that's a lot about conducting interviews. And I know I said that this talk's not going to go over what to do after the interviews, like debriefing what you heard in the analysis or sharing that out with your team. And I just want to mention that we do have a talk on qualitative analysis on our YouTube channel. It's called It's in the Details, the Magic of Analyzing User Research. Adrian did a fantastic job on that. So if you want to do a deep dive on research analysis, go check out this video. And that's a wrap, folks. So I want to revisit some of the major themes that I hope that you could take back with you today and apply them to your next UX interview. So first, understand your goals and objectives. This will set you up for success. If you are clear on what you're trying to discover from your research, this will help make for a smooth process. And to have great questions, make sure they're not leading or biased or loaded with assumptions. Write broad and open-ended questions that are neutral and ladder up to your goals and objectives. And be that neutral, courteous apprentice who plays dumb with a smile. And I've already hit this point time and time again. Don't ask them to predict the future. And finally, the most important skill you can have as an interviewer is just shush up and give them the floor to talk. And on that note, I'm going to shush up now myself and say thank you very much and check in with my crew to see if we have any questions.
We do. We have a few. One of the questions, come over here, Wendell. One of the questions that came through was, do you have any tips about identifying the problem to solve if stakeholders are having trouble articulating the actual problem?
Well, you as a UX interview are going to ask that question, right? You can ask probing questions to ask that. I mean, ask that direct question. What problem are we trying to solve? It really frames the mindset out of the feature mode, right? Gets them to think about, because a lot of times it's not a problem that we're trying to solve. And you need to surface that too. So use your interview skills and ask them deeper, like, what are we trying to learn? What are we trying to solve? What problem? What user group has this problem? Really doing some deep dive into understanding that, focusing on the user rather than focusing on pushing out features in a product.
Yeah, definitely. There's another question around how to interrupt a rambler. How do you get them to stop just verbalizing everything in their head and focus on what you need them to provide feedback on?
Good question. Yes. Ooh, I had a dime for every time I was in that situation. Say, yeah, oh, okay. Use some of these one word, like, oh, yeah, oh, okay, just a minute. Okay, gotcha. I mean, you might have to be that overt. You can try coughing at first, but you might have to be, oh, wait, just 1 second. Okay. And then use one of those phrases. I like what you're going with there, but I want to get back to this question I asked you. So we'll revisit that in a minute, but let's talk about this. So you might verbally have to be like, whoa, wait, sorry, or okay. I do that a lot. Go, yes, yep, okay. Those are probably my 2 go-to words when I want to stop someone from going off the rails completely.
Totally. Another question was, how do you deal with coworkers that are perhaps a little too involved in the research and interview process? They are not researchers. They are maybe product people, and they have their own way that they would like things done, and they are not really interested in hearing what you have to say about it as the researcher who's actually doing the work.
Yeah, I've been there. I was in an interview. We were on a roundtable discussion, and participant was at the head of the table. I was conducting the research, and I had 2 other product people taking notes. And the person was talking about their car buying experience, and it was negative. A lot of people don't really love to go shopping for cars. And one of my note takers said, really? I've never heard anything like that. Are you sure? I held myself from smacking her. But it definitely changed the conversation. That the participant clammed up, didn't want to talk. They felt dumb. They felt on the spot. So it might be, you might have to wait till after the interview to kind of stop that behavior from continuing again. But, that's why it's important to assign roles and say, look, I appreciate your input, but I'm running the session, and you are really valuable as a note taker. And I really need you to master that and to rule that and go with that. And if it's a matter of, well, I have good questions, I'm like, great, then let's see how we can potentially put those into the next round. But back to those goals, setting that research plan and setting that scope, it might be that those questions are out of scope, or you could say, look, we were super tight on time as it is, and I think your questions are great. We have agreed upon what we want to learn in this session, and we need to prioritize those first. If we have some time, we'll roll some of your questions in, but let's see how it goes in the next one to see how time works. So those are some suggestions I would have. I don't know, Laura, do you have anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, we kind of went back in the chat a little bit. One of my suggestions was to have a meeting with them and try to explain to them, like, this is the process. This is why researchers go through the process this way. This is how I structure things. This is why I structure the activities the way I do. Let's talk about the problems you have with it. Because if they're just pushing back on you and they can't really articulate why, get them to articulate. Often there's nothing there. It's just that they didn't think of it. So Get them in a room or a Zoom and talk with them. One last question. Somebody is doing a project with a teenager. Any interview tips with working with teenagers?
Is that to suggest that teenagers aren't human beings?
They could be a little bit different than your typical engineer that I have to talk to. That's for sure.
That's true. That's a very good point. It's the same with children, right? I guess you keep it simple. Do your best to talk on their level. I mean, it all I can't give specific guidance because I don't know what you're trying to learn or what the topic is, how sensitive it is. But they're still human beings, whether they're teenagers, men, women, no matter what. So obviously show them respect. You might want to be a little bit more casual with a teenager, but also that could backfire. And they're like, you're weird. You're not 18. Why are you talking like that? You're 45. Like,
oh my
stop being
God, no,
weirdo.
don't use slang. Just don't do that. No, don't
Right.
do that. Yeah, I've tested with my fair share of kids and teenagers, and you have to read the room. Read your teenager. If they don't want to be there, don't come in like Chippy the Clown. They're not going to like that. Try to match them as best you can, and then see if they'll open up to you. If they're there, they're happy to be there, they want to give you feedback, you can treat them like anybody who's come through the door. And if you have little kids, make sure mom or dad or somebody who's responsible for that little kid is there in the room with you. They need to be there physically with you, with the kid. And then bring crayons and some paper, because just because you think you can talk to that kid for half an hour, that kid is not really ready to talk to you for half an hour. Not without some Play-Doh or some crayons or something.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else, Lori?
Nope, that was it.
I have a couple other announcements I forgot to say at the beginning. Again, this Vimeo video will be coming to you when we get it processed. Give us some time. And it's going to be on your email that you used to register for Eventbrite. So look at that email address. We're not going to have networking breakout rooms today. Sorry, I think you've heard enough talking from me for one night. So I'm going to give you guys a break, but we're going to have another next on the 23rd after Michaela's event. We'll have some networking opportunities then. So come prepared to meet some other UX friends then. And I think that's it. I think those were the two things I wanted to cover that I forgot to mention earlier on. So please fill out the survey. I think we'll throw that in the chat one more time, but it'll also come in your email. So let us know how we can make these events the best that they can be for you. Let us know. And with that, I will bid everyone a good evening.